So I'm just going to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes, depending on how it goes, just explaining some of the work that AHDB is doing around glyphosate resistance, which I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with. So perhaps it won't take 15 minutes. So this slide will be familiar to those of you who were over at the Rothamsted stand a few minutes ago. This is the number of species of weeds which are resistant to glyphosate in the world. The first species recorded in the mid-1990s. We're now up to 34 according to Weed Science website. And you're probably thinking, well, most of those are associated with glyphosate-tolerant GMO crops. And you would be right. Most of those are in North America, South America, where people are growing a lot of glyphosate-tolerant crops, applying a lot of glyphosate. But, and I'm sorry about the screen, you may or may not be able to see very well, there are a few species there that have been found in Europe which are resistant to glyphosate. And of course we don't have any glyphosate-tolerant crops in Europe, so it's not just a problem with glyphosate-tolerant crops, it can also be a problem in normal agricultural systems. And some of those species are ones we have in the UK. So, should we be concerned? Yes, we should. And again, quite a familiar graph to any of you who know this subject. It's the usage of glyphosate on UK crops from the Pesticide Usage Survey. And there's been a big increase since the early 1990s, up from about 300,000 hectares a year to about 2 million hectares a year receiving glyphosate every year. And that has, of course, been driven quite a lot by the resistance problems with blackgrass. A lot of that glyphosate has been applied to blackgrass. And we know the more of a herbicide you apply, the more you're going to like to drive resistance. So again, a reason for concern. In fact, you're all here this morning, shows you have some interest in this issue. We're all concerned about glyphosate resistance. And although, if you look at that graph, those species on that graph of glyphosate-resistant weeds worldwide, most of them are actually broadleaf weeds. I think the weeds we're most concerned about in the UK are the grasses, blackgrass, because it's a problem already and we're very reliant on glyphosate for controlling it. Ryegrasses, because in certain parts of the country they're a problem already, and we know from experience elsewhere in the world, ryegrasses can become resistant to glyphosate. And also bromes, again, a weed species which is tricky to control at the best of times, and we know brome species can become resistant to glyphosate. So I'll start with good news. There is good news about glyphosate resistance in UK weed species. In terms of blackgrass, so far there is no known case of glyphosate resistance in blackgrass in the UK. Indeed, there are no known cases of resistance in blackgrass anywhere. Blackgrass is a bit of an issue across Northern Europe, Germany, Northern France, Denmark. You have a problem. No known case of glyphosate resistance at all. So that is the first piece of good news. Second piece of good news is that no glyphosate-resistant ryegrasses have been found in the UK. Elsewhere in Europe, elsewhere in the world, but not in the UK. So 2 bits of good news. However, you probably can't see the map on the right, but it's not particularly important. There is some less good news. In terms of blackgrass, we now know that some populations are starting to show reduced sensitivity to glyphosate. The map on the right, which you probably can't see, is from some work done by the BBSRC AHDB Blackgrass Research Initiative, and they've sampled around 130 populations of blackgrass. And one thing they've done amongst a huge project is to test those populations in the glasshouse for glyphosate resistance. They applied a full label rate, 540 grams active ingredients per hectare equivalent to those populations, and most of those populations were sensitive to glyphosate, as you'd expect. But there were a small number that seemed to have reduced sensitivity to glyphosate. So there seems to be a shift in populations to less sensitivity, some populations. And it's not just this project, other people have looked at this issue, and again, seem to see this shifting sensitivity of blackgrass to glyphosate. If you want to know more about that particular piece of work, so Rothamsted Research did that work. David Conant is over on the stand at Rothamsted. You can go and talk to him today about that piece of work. And in terms of sampling for resistance, we are doing a reasonable amount of it, but we're probably not doing enough. If you take the analysis for the herbicide resistance committee, which is an industry body which tries to develop good practice for herbicide resistance, they suggest that the scale of sampling we're doing is just not going to be enough to pick up resistance in blackgrass or any other weed at an early stage, where we're talking a few plants here and there. They've estimated that to pick up individual resistant plants, you would need to sample something like 4,000 hectares and test 100 million plants every year to be able to pick that up. And we're nowhere near that scale of testing, and logistically it's simply impossible. So the most likely route we're going to have of finding glyphosate resistance in the UK is when we get a complaint from a farmer saying, I've applied glyphosate, doesn't seem to have worked, and they speak to their agronomist, the manufacturer, it gets tested, and we find glyphosate resistance. And according to HRAG, at that point, that population could be 30 to 40% resistant. If it is at that level, then there's a good chance the resistance will have spread to other fields, perhaps even to other farms. So we really need to be on top of resistance, use good anti-resistance strategies, because when it appears, it's probably already going to spread beyond the initial place. And there is more less good news. Talking about brome species, we know there is some kind of shift happening in bromes. The work that's been done on bromes is quite limited, but we know Rothamsted have detected two populations which are showing marginal resistance to glyphosate. That's on the Crop Protect website at Rothamsted, and I believe there's a paper going to come out on that particular piece of work quite soon. And we also know about sterile brome that it can become resistant to ACCAs and ALS inhibitor herbicides, because that's been shown in Europe. So again, something to be concerned about. Herbicide resistance developing in brome, sterile brome, and we know sterile brome is a difficult weed to control at the best of times. And ryegrass, I've said already we don't have any glyphosate resistant ryegrass in the UK, but glyphosate resistant ryegrass has been detected in arable systems in Italy. We've known about it in things like orchards and vineyards for quite a long time, but it's now been detected in arable systems in Italy. And some of our populations, probably around 500 populations of ryegrass in the UK, are already resistant to either ALS and ACCA inhibitors. And those problem populations are very difficult to control, as bad as blackgrass, if not worse. And we could get glyphosate resistance on top of that. Okay, so that's where we are. What can we do about it? What has AHDB been doing about it? Well, 2 years ago at Cereals, we launched, along with the Weed Resistance Action Group, these guidelines on how to try and minimise the risk of glyphosate resistance in the UK. And you may not be able to see very well, but out of that piece of work done by WRAG, there were 4 action points came out. The first one was to prevent survivors. So if there are glyphosate-resistant individuals out there and they survive an application, they're killed by another means. That can be cultivation, or that could be another herbicide, but you mustn't let those survivors reproduce, spread seed, and spread that resistance. The second point was to maximise efficacy, so that's using the right dose rate on the right growth stage of the weed, because we know that low dose rates are a way of driving resistance in weeds. Third point was to use alternatives. I've already said cultivations, different herbicides, different cropping patterns, so you're not using the same herbicides all the time. We know we're very reliant on glyphosate for blackgrass control, so we need to be thinking about moving away from crops that are so reliant on that glyphosate. And finally, monitoring success. I've already said it's unlikely at the level of sampling we're doing as an industry to pick up glyphosate resistance very early. We're going to be reliant on farmers, agronomists picking that resistance up. So monitoring success. Are the patches of whatever weed which seem to have survived in a field when everything else has died, or individual weeds which have survived a glyphosate application while everything else around seems to be dead? There's some early indicators of possible glyphosate resistance, and you need to get it tested before it becomes a significant problem. But in developing those guidelines, it became evident that there were gaps in our knowledge. They're the best guidelines we've got at the moment, but they're not complete. So AHDB along with the companies at the bottom, which you may or may not be able to see. I'm not going to go through them because there are a lot of them. Put together this project to look at how we manage glyphosate better to maintain its effectiveness against, we're focusing on in this project on blackgrass and ryegrass. And one of the very first pieces of information, the result that has come out of this project, is that you don't need to apply lots and lots of applications of glyphosate in the autumn to get good control of glyphosate in the following crop. 2 applications of a full label rate will give you almost complete control, and you certainly don't need to go any higher than 3. And that's not there's some more bits of information come out of that initial piece of work, looking at 113 trials done by these different companies, and the researchers from that project, Lynn Tatman is over there on the stand this morning for today and tomorrow, so you can go and talk to her about that project and about some of the more of the results from it. The other thing we're doing in terms of project work is to look at bromes. I've already said bromes are an increasing concern. We seem to be having more and more reports in the industry of problems controlling brome. So we've commissioned this project with the companies at the bottom, manufacturers, to look at what's going on with bromes. Is it the fact that we're getting herbicide resistance appearing, whether that's to glyphosate or to other herbicides, or is it simply we're changing our management systems, that's opening the door for brome populations? It's led by AHDAS. It also includes Rothamsted Research and Steve Moss Consultancy, and Laura Davies, who's sitting here today. She's leading that project, so if you want to know more about that project, go and speak to her. There is a survey, the project's only just started, a survey to try and get a handle on what's going on with bromes. So you can go and speak to Laura there. I've got a few slips here which have got that address on it. Please get involved in that project and help along. So just to brief sum up, what can you do to try and stop glyphosate resistance in the UK? Well, I think a key point is ask if the farming system you're talking about is too reliant on glyphosate. We have become very reliant on glyphosate, particularly in wheat rape rotations, and actually can we change the farming system so we're less reliant on glyphosate? If you haven't got a copy, get a copy of the anti-resistance guidelines and ensure you follow them. As I've said, they're not perfect. We know there are gaps in them, but they're the best knowledge we have. And as far as we know, they are going to reduce the risk of glyphosate resistance appearing. And finally, a point, if you're farmers, agronomists, try and engage with research on not just AHDB projects, but any projects, any bits of work looking at resistance in weeds, because we need your involvement in order if we're going to keep managing this problem effectively. I haven't said anything about regulation and about the re-registration of glyphosate. I'm sure there are plenty of people on the Cereal site who'll discuss that with you if you want to. There is, I'll just flag up a debate in the Arable Conference, which is somewhere over there, stand 824 at 11:45, discussing the issue of pre-harvest glyphosate use. Thank you very much.